Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the program. My name is John Roberti. This is Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. And today's topic is there choice in cheer? Considering market competition in competitive cheering. Oftentimes, when we try to talk about the competition laws and you know the places in which we practice, we try to find industries examples that are kind of fun to illustrate some of the concepts. And there is now I think increased interest in the cheer world with some television shows that are very interesting to folks, and frankly, a lot of people participating in it. So today we're going to speak to a guest who has thought about competition in the cheer market and learn a little bit more about that and how it applies more broadly. My co-host today is Danielle Haugland. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, John, and thanks so much for having us today. Today we're going to be talking about all things cheer, and that is the cheerocracy, the cheeropoly, potential cheeropoly in the competitive cheer market. We're going to be talking about what is the market, if there is market, and why it's important for kids.
So cheer, I get cheer is important, but why is it important for us more broadly to understand these various issues?
Well, there's two reasons. One is, as I mentioned, for children, there's a safety issue in cheer. So the governing body and who controls that governing body is important. That's what we're going to talk about Matt today about. And then second, how looking at the cheer industry and a potential monopoly in that industry applies to our political and economic system more broadly. Great.
Well, who's our guest today?
So we are really lucky to have Matt Stoller as our guest today. Matt is the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, and he's the brains behind the Big newsletter, which covers the politics of monopoly.
Great. Well, let's bring him in. Matt Stoller, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Matt, so much. So I wanted to do just a little bit of background about why you are here. I happen to be a cheer mom. I think I mentioned that before. Two of my children do competitive cheer. And I'm also an antitrust lawyer. And never in a million years did I think that those two worlds would collide. But I happen to follow you on Twitter. And I noticed in, completely unrelated to cheer, of course, I noticed in some of the cheer chats that I follow, there was this article going around about the monopoly of cheer. And I noticed it was authored by Matt Stoller. And so I immediately reached out and thought, I want to talk to that guy because this is the rare instance of those worlds colliding. So I was intrigued by your take on the market generally. So I'm hoping that you can kind of walk us through how you see the cheer industry today, and then we can talk about how that is potentially a reflection of other markets and our overall political and economic system.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And it's I don't know anything about cheerleading really. I'm interested in weird monopolies, and so a colleague was watching the Netflix show Cheer, and there was this brief snippet where the head of a whole bunch of coaches were like, varsity controls everything, like this really conspiratorial tone, and then it just kind of went on sort of the soap opera. It's a great series. But so my colleague is like, hey, Matt, this seems like, she did some Googling. She's like, oh, this seems like a monopoly. And so she sent a couple of articles over to me, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, this seems a lot like John D. Rockefeller with glitter, right? Where a lot of the similar tactics were used, in particular to sell cheerleading paraphernalia, so outfits and equipment. And so I just did some analysis of the market and wrote an article about how Varsity Brands, which is the main company that controls competitions in a lot of the apparel market, how they organize the cheer market. And then I guess it went viral and hit a bunch of the cheer communities. And then I started getting a whole bunch of people, talking to me and saying, oh, you have no idea how dirty the cheer industry is and how much, sort of coercion, bribery, and all these other things in there. And it's a lot. I mean, I like weird monopolies, but, the thing that I see across the political economy, you go into rooms full of booksellers or doctors or tech entrepreneurs, and there's this just tremendous sense of fear. And that's what I found in the cheer industry as well, among coaches and sales reps and various people. And they're all afraid of varsity. So totally fascinating.
Yeah, I get that. So I'm in a unique position interviewing you because I'm a consumer in this industry.
Right.
And one of what I'd like to hear your take on is, so my kids do competitive elite cheer, which is basically private cheer. Mm-hmm. It's not high school cheer. It's not college cheer. It's not associated with that. So I don't really see that world as much as I see the competitive cheer world, where we do have my kids compete in competitions, the goal of which is to get an invitation to the summit,
right,
which is kind of like the Super Bowl of cheer. But again, I don't have an insight into the school, or what we call sideline cheer, where you're actually cheering on a team, and perhaps you compete against other schools. And so one of the questions that I have for you is, it seems pretty decentralized. So what is the market? Are there two markets perhaps? Is there a market in the competitive cheer vertical? And then is there a separate market potentially in the kind of school-based cheer vertical?
I don't know. I haven't done like an official market definition here. I was really looking at competitive cheer, but then what you find is that it does bleed into high school cheer and college cheer. And now there's this attempt to make to do cheer on an international scale. So I've gotten some comments about that. And every part of the cheer industry works differently, but varsity is a key player in every part of it. So in terms of the cheer competition, so you're talking about Summit, what varsity did in that particular area, because that's what I looked into, was they basically bought up all of the competitions. So there were a series, or most of them. There was a series of mergers, and the last one, or the biggest one, I guess, was in 2015. And it was when varsity bought their main competitor, which was called Jam Brands. And now they control, and there hasn't been aggressive market analysis here, but probably 90% of the competitions. And so if you want to enter the competitions, if you want to get what's called a bid for Summit, or if you want to achieve go further, then you have to play by varsity's rules. And one of the things that varsity did is they do a lot of distribution of their equipment and apparel at their competitions, and they have prevented competitors like Rebel Athletics from showing their wares at these competitions. In fact, when Jam Brands was independent, Rebel would distribute through Jam Brand competitions, and then they ended that distribution arrangement when the merger happened. So it's the control of the competitions that is really important in terms of being able to sell apparel. And then the other piece of what they do is that, you have a lot of independent gyms. I think varsity owns a few gyms, although it's not really how there's control. What happens is that a lot of gyms have rebate agreements with varsity. So they'll get paid more money if they go to more competitions or if they sell more apparel. And as a result, varsity, and you wouldn't necessarily know that as a parent. I got some emails from parents who were like, I had no idea. And so the equipment and the apparel is more expensive than it should be, and it's because the gym owners are getting rebates for being gyms that are where they buy from varsity.
So Matt, I want to try to understand, just to break this down a little bit. Let's break it down. It sounds like number of different people, if we're correct about the market and the monopoly and all, number of different people could potentially be hurt. Let's break them into buckets. First group, who would you say? What's one group that could be hurt by this?
Well, there's a number of different groups. I haven't gotten into the schools because I think there's a separate play that's happening there. I think the biggest, there's kind of two, there's a lot of different groups that could be hurt, but I think that the biggest problem is a safety issue, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the issues is, cheer is incredibly dangerous. And it's amazing. It's gymnastics, but it's not regulated as a sport. One of the things that the varsity's been very aggressive at, and they control most of the governing bodies, or all the governing bodies except for a few here or there on a college level. They really try to control the safety standards, and so it can be really dangerous because you're not necessarily. There was just a contest, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, where there was a hole in the floor, the springboard floor, and there were a bunch of different injuries. And so on a safety level, you can. I think when you have a one company controlling governing bodies, it can be dangerous. And the other area is that I heard a lot of people telling me that there are kind of coercive, dangerous situations outside of just cheer, and that's not just for the athletes themselves who are teenagers, but also cheer coaches who are often pretty young. And so I heard from some older people who had been in the industry, there's a lot of harassment and things like that go on. So I think those are really important problems. And then in terms of the straight up kind of antitrust problems, you just see that prices in this industry are really high, and in lots of different ways. It's not just the apparel, it's also the prices for things like Summit are really high for, just soda and drinks and things like that, and tickets. But also, there are these, for some of the events, and I don't know if you've been to events that have this arrangement, they have what are called state of play arrangements, where you have to book your travel, where you're staying, through an approved, effectively a travel agent or hotel. And if you don't do that, then you can't participate in the competition. And that's just, so what ends up happening is that if you don't have money, and a lot of people in cheer are affluent, but a lot of them aren't, it's really hard to stay in the cheer business, and or in the cheer sport, and it's becoming more and more of a kind of luxury area. And so consumers are getting ripped off, but also the sport itself is being hurt. And as somebody told me, 10 years ago, you could kind of get into it and be sort of middle class, and now, it's increasingly the spirit of cheer is dying, right? People are getting second jobs, to try to afford it for their kid. And so it's a real problem, but I would say that you've got the consumer harm, you've got the safety issue, you've probably got lower pay for coaches and judges and things like that. So there's a lot of different stakeholders that are being harmed.
It's interesting because sometimes in these entertainment industries, we've looked at some of them. The one that's come to mind, and maybe it's not a great example, but the professional wrestling entertainment seems like that
right.
There's more or less one body.
That's right.
And that I believe, if I'm recalling right, that merger was actually looked at, I believe, by the federal regulators and went through.
Yeah, same with the Jam Brands one. And I think they weren't necessarily looking at the labor monopsony issue. That's kind of a more recent trend to say, labor monopsony is a thing that matters. Not that they really look at it, but they've that it's a very clear case, the wrestling one, and then we'll probably see more.
Yeah, and I suspect sometimes when people look at this, they might say, well, cheer in a sense competes with gymnastics, and it competes with dance. Because right. They're different activities, and if the prices are raised too high, then consumers and others would just go to these different sports. I'm actually going to ask both of you, both as the consumer and as somebody who's kind of looked at it from the outside, what's your reaction to that? Do you think that that's the right way to think about it?
I don't, right? If you talk to people in Western Pennsylvania, the cheer is a really important part of their culture, right? Their kids love it. And you can't just say, you're not going to do this anymore. You're going to do gymnastics or dance. If there might not be dance teams around there or gymnastics gyms. And also that's just where their friends are, right? So it's not fair to just do this to kids, but also it's not obvious that there is a substitutable good there.
Danielle, what do you think?
I agree to a certain extent. So this is probably a good time in the program to say that the views expressed herein are my own, and they do not reflect my kids or my cheer gym or my company for that matter. So on our teams, we have a fair number of kids that came over from gymnastics and dance, and vice versa. We have kids that try out cheer and realize, okay, no, I really like the tumbling aspect, so I'm going to move into gymnastics. Or I really like the dancing, but I don't like the tumbling, so I'm going to move into dance. So I do think that there's some elasticity there. But Matt, I also think you're correct in that getting down to the cultural and societal level, this is a community, and the kids, my kids' best friends are their teammates, and they would be crushed if they went to a different sport or a different gym. And that's the other thing I wanted to ask too. So there's competition at the gym level as well. So, but that also impacts or has it relates to competition at the competition at the cheer competition level. So, for example, in my area, Northwest Washington, we have about 4 gyms to choose from, and one of our criteria in selecting a cheer gym is the extent to which that cheer gym is successful in competitions in getting to Summit. And I'm proud to say, actually, this year, my Dynasty ladies from Northwest Silver Stars got a bid to Summit. We're very excited for them. My Rad girls are still searching for that Summit bid, but we really hope they get it. But Matt, I wanted to ask you about that. How do you isolate or look at competition at the kind of gym level, which is what I see, and relate that to competition at the cheer competition level?
Well, first of all, I love this monopoly because it's such, I deal with big tech and various other, and there's all this kind of like, oh, there are economies of scale here, or it's just like it's cheerleading. There are no economies of scale. It's cheerleading, right? So it's hilarious. And I just love it because it is so many aspects of our culture in one, in one business. I would say that when you're talking about competition between gyms, that's a real mechanism for varsity to maintain control because they do control the scoring systems. And I've heard a lot of rumors that, they do actually, it's not just a metaphor when you say, oh, somebody rigs the rules. Like they actually do Jeff Webb, who owns Varsity, did actually mention that at a certain point that, they give, at least in one contest, they gave different scoring because people were using Varsity equipment. So, bids to Summit are a really important mechanism to control gyms because a gym that gets a bid to Summit has a much better has a better economic opportunity than a gym that doesn't. And so the gym owners are really afraid, and I have a number of them that talk to me, and one of them stopped talking to me, and several of them, nobody would go kind of on the record because they're afraid. Their economic livelihood is in the hands of Varsity. So that's kind of how I would look at it. It's a good thing that you have a bunch of gyms that are competing. The problem is that they are actually all under the control of the corporation that owns all the contests.
So, and again, just to maybe raise the issue, sometimes when people say, you talked about economies of sales, it sounds to me like you're projecting the idea, perhaps, that the contests are better if one company can kind of invest in them and, sort of coordinate activities, things like that. Is there any argument that, one, for a market that might be considered to be relatively small, that having just one provider is better?
Well, so there's a little bit of market power for each individual competition, but that's because, people schedule competitions, year in advance, right? You're just like, oh, this is every May, there's this competition, every November, there's this other competition in this other place, and people make travel arrangements, and they're used to it, right? It's, it's like tennis, the U.S. Open, or any sort of, or just any the Little League. You know when the season's going to start and end. But there's no reason that all has to be controlled by one company, and it wasn't controlled by one company until relatively recently. And because of the roll up, now it is. And it's not like they create. I mean, they did create some new contests, but mostly a lot of the competitions, they already existed. They were just bought by Varsity. And the thing is you don't actually need to have a company do it, right? You have one of the Varsity is sort of in conflict with the NCAA, which can run these kinds of competitions, and it doesn't have to be. You can have a federated structure where you don't have a corporation that's just in charge of it and using it to extract revenue. So it is, while there is sort of some value in having an understandable schedule, it's not that there is anything inherently important about concentrating it into the hands of one for-profit corporation that is lobbying to prevent it from becoming a sport or from being called a sport.
So I think that's an interesting jumping off point and a good jumping off point to expand the conversation out to monopolies generally and what we can learn, or what you saw in the cheer industry that was also applicable to other industries and other potential monopolies. You noted that in your article that, this may be a somewhat esoteric industry, but what you're seeing here certainly is not unique.
Yeah, I mean, what I love about, so monopolies, it's always about power, right? And I think that the last 40 years of antitrust practice, we've really gotten away from that question of power and who has it. I say we as if I'm an antitrust lawyer. I'm not. But traditionally, at least I went in the archives and spent a couple of years researching for my book on this story. And there was this really strange transformation where people started saying, oh, all we care about is a consumer standpoint, right? And this kind of happened in the 1970s and early 80s. And there was this transformation where we would say, oh, well, we really have to look at whether, a consumer was harmed before we can take action, to the point where, we're like legitimately debating about whether kids can switch into dance or tumbling, and as opposed to, just noting that it's crazy that Bain Capital, which owns Varsity Brands, is controlling and structuring a whole swath of our culture and making it much harder for children to have a childhood.
I want to come back to your book in a second, but let me ask you this: what would what would Varsity Brands say in response to being called a monopoly?
I don't know. I mean, my guess is they would say what they said on cheer was, we support cheerleading and we make no excuses for that. But I'm guessing they would say the same thing that most monopolists say, which is that they provide some sort of benefit from their integration, or they help ensure continuity or safety standards or whatever it is. Or they would say probably we're not a monopoly, right? So they would both make the argument, oh, there is some competition here, and also we generate benefits from our scale and from our business structure. That's my guess.
Okay, now turning back to your book, it's interesting because within our association, we've had a debate recently in the last few years about what is the basis of competition law, what is the basis of antitrust. There's to get a little bit into the weeds, there are folks who talk about the consumer welfare standard, right, and then folks who talk about history. Tell us about your book. What inspired you to write? Tell us what the book is about, and what are the key lessons?
Well, it's about the great contest that courses throughout American history, really going back to the Revolution, although I kind of started the book in the turn of the 20th century, about this fight between democratic ways of organizing markets, liberty in the marketplace, as FDR put it, and autocratic ways of organizing markets, which we're in a great period of autocracy, and that is a monopolist way of organizing markets. So when I look at the problem, and this is traditionally how New Dealers and kind of pre-1970s antitrust attorneys and thinkers thought about concentration. Concentration is autocratic, right? It is it is a form of politics, right? It is a political system, right? And we don't think of it that way. We think of always look at this business versus that business. But a monopoly is not just a business. It is a mini dictator over a market. And when you have a whole series of mini dictators over a market, and this came up in the 1930s and 40s, really obviously when they were looking across the ocean and seeing fascism, it bleeds into the political system, and so part of what was happening throughout American history is this sense that we are fighting aristocrats, and aristocrats can take the form of bankers, monopolists, open, what you saw in Italy with fascists, and the way to address that was through populist mechanisms, and which was antitrust and anti-monopoly rules and regulations. Today, we'd probably look at the aristocrats and say, oh, it's the economists, right? The economists have created an aristocracy where they hide their political assumptions in math. It's a highly corrupt set of actors. Industrial organizations is largely garbage. And so you're seeing a really important pushback in the political system because people have noticed that we are living in a society that is dominated by a few people. And it looks different in every market. So Cheer is a great example because it hits specific communities in a very visceral way that matters to those communities, but it hits every community in lots of different ways.
What parallels do you see? I think you've covered this a little bit, but you talked about what parallels do you see between throughout the history and what's going on today?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of parallels, I think that. So I have there's a chapter in my book called Trustbusters Against Hitler, which looks at the integration of the U.S. defense industrial base and German cartels, right? And Hitler was using cartel arrangements to control American industrial capacity. And so antitrust attorneys, including Thurman Arnold, but many others, went in and dealt with that through aggressive antitrust and anti-cartel actions. And I think you see something similar with our relationships with China, where you have this incredible integration and the Chinese using coercive corporate tools. And we have to concentrate power over the American order. You saw that with the NBA. You see it all over the place. So that's one really obvious analogy. Another one is you see kind of a soft autocracy, right? You see more dictatorial language. I think you can look at I saw this after the financial crisis. I think you could look at some of the political figures right now. I mean, I'm a Democrat, so I could look at Trump and I could see some.
You're a Democrat?
I'm a Democrat, yeah. But I look at some of the technocratic language that came out of the Obama administration. I see a very autocratic face to that, but I also see sort of Trump does not respect liberal democracy, and I think that is the reason that people hear that and are okay with it is because. Liberal democracy has not been in the marketplace for 40 years, so people are used to being bossed around. So that's where we are.
So if I wanted to get a copy of your book, where would I go?
So you could go to Amazon, you could go to IndieBound, and you could go to bookstores if you wanted it. I mean, I don't judge. If we live in an era of monopoly, so if you buy from Amazon, go ahead.
And tell us the name of the title again.
It's called Goliath: The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy.
Okay, good. Then I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, Matt.
Sure.
Can you tell us something unusual, interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally?
Yeah. So I was a star and star and writer for a show on FX, a very short-lived show called Brand X with Russell Brand, which was super weird and fun. And I did that in LA for about 6 months. And you probably wouldn't know that I was on a show with Russell Brand.
Well, and you were the star. How did
I was a star? I mean, he was the star. Okay. Like I was like the sidekick.
And what did that mean that you were the sidekick? Like, what did you do?
Well, he was trying to do sort of a more radical version of the Daily Show, which at the time was kind of a big thing. And he had me on to be a political analyst and sort of explain how politics worked. And we were trying to work it out, and we never cracked the format, but. It's fun to hang out in LA with Russell Brand. Really weird.
He's brilliant. This may I actually haven't done that. That's on the bucket list to hang out in LA.
It's weird because he always talked about you. He's always like, yeah.
That was before the podcast.
What I thought he was like on an episode. Whatever. All right.
Okay. Well,
I got confused with the episodes.
Yeah, there's this sequence. No, but we're going to talk about that after the program, and we'll see about getting Russell Brand on the program. But I think now is the time for us to do the final segment, which you call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
And in my left hand, I have an actual hat that has actual questions in it. And we're going to ask Matt to pull out a question, and the question he pulls out is the question we will ask.
This is really weird.
Ooh, the suspense.
Says the guy who was on the Brand X with Russell Brand. But
I'm a hypocrite. It's fine.
Okay. Okay. So Matt, if you couldn't be a journalist, what would you be?
You know, it's a hard question for me to answer. I mean, I'd probably, I don't know, because what have I wanted to be? I may be a lawyer. I don't know. I mean, I enjoy reading about the law. It's fun.
Okay, when you were 5, what did you want to be?
When I was 5, I wanted to be an investment banker. Weirdly enough. It was really strange. Maybe when I was 8. I mean, when you're 5, you want to be a fireman, right? Like,
yeah.
When I was like, I used to dress up in like slacks and like a dress shirt and hold a briefcase and be like, I didn't know what an investment banker was, but I wanted to do that.
And do you ever go to a party and tell people, see, this only works for, the question really only works for lawyers, but do you ever go to a party and tell people, you know, I'm not really a journalist. I am a star on an FX show with Russell Brand or whatever. What do you ever tell them you're something else?
I tell them I'm a school bus engineer.
Does that help?
No. I don't lie about my profession.
You know, we had a guy on here who claimed to have been a rodeo clown.
Yeah.
That wasn't true. So, and with that, I think that's our time today. Thank you for joining us on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.